Okay, so as soon as we're talking about cages, I'm going to give you another story about no, this was funny. This wasn't dangerous, but I was running an expedition and uh, probably 10, I used to take 10 people at a time on an expedition. So, and this was a 2 week, no, 10-day expedition, a 10-day expedition. So we had this German guy, really cool guy named Helmut, and I called him Fritz. It's just the way I am. And he actually came up to me. I kept calling him Fritz, and he says, "Craig, why are you calling me Fritz?" Because he felt offended. I said, it's just like me calling my buddy a nickname. You know, it's no offense meant. It's just that's how we are in South Africa. You just call, "Hey, bud," or "Put," or "Fritz," or "Chop," or whatever it may be. And then he was okay. Anyway, so we're out there one day. It's not a long story, but we're out there the one day. And we were still using the round cage that I explained. We used to use these round cages. I think they had a diameter of 1.3 meters. So it's quite a big, two people can easily and comfortably fit in one of these round cages. And in those days, they used to drift from the boat. So we pull up the boat, you get into the cage, and then we drifted away. And you're in the cage, and the sharks swim around the cage, and they push the cage around. But because it's round, it just rolls off every time they push it or bump it or whatever it may be. But anyway, so Helmut is in the cage, and he's on scuba gear. So we've all been diving, we've all been in the cage, and all the guys have been in the cage, and we're working with the sharks, and we're tagging the sharks, and we're just having a ball of a time out there. So he gets in this cage, and I still can't figure this out until, even today I can't figure it out. So he gets in the cage, and he's down on his own with scuba gear. And we had a big shark. It was probably about a 4.5 meter shark. We had several sharks around the boat, but this particular shark was really into it. And it was around the cage and bumping the cage and bumping the boat, and just having a ball of a time. We had already tagged it, but at some point it swims around, and the tether line or the rope that attaches the cage to the boat, the shark comes up and grabs the rope. And grabs the rope and freaks out, because now suddenly the shark, it's like a horse with a stirrup in his mouth, or whatever you call it, a bit in his mouth. And it freaks the shark out. So the shark starts thrashing, the cage bounces around with Fritz inside the cage, Helmut, and the shark just bites the rope off. So we're scrambling around, and I'm shouting to the guys, "Okay, give anchor rope, because now the cage is drifting away from the boat." So you just give slack on the anchor rope, and then you drift up to the cage, because the boat has got a lot more windage than the cage has. But on that particular day, there was no wind. So the boat kind of just stood in one place, and Helmut went drifting off into the distance. And then I realized, okay, well, screw it. Just let him go. See how it is. So I kid you not, he doesn't come up. The shark's just had the rope in its mouth. The cage has been bashed all over the place. I'm still in the cage, and the cage is just drifting off. And we're sitting there on the boat, and we're kidding ourselves laughing, because he doesn't realize that he's not attached to the boat anymore. So anyway, off he goes. And eventually he's about 75 meters from the boat, and his head pops up, and he looks back towards the boat, and we wave to him. He goes back down, and there's a shark circling around the cage. He goes back down, and we let him drift for like 200 meters. And eventually I said, "Okay, guys, pull up the anchor. Let's go fetch Helmut." So we pull up the anchor, and we go in, and we get up to the cage, and he suddenly realizes there's a boat there, and he comes out the water, and completely nonplussed at all. And I'm like, "Helmut, what?" And he's like, "What, back?" And we're laughing, we kill ourselves laughing. He says, "What are you laughing at?" So I said, but dude, the shark bit the rope off, we just let you go. And he says, oh, I thought this was how you do this shark diving. He had no clue whatsoever that he was just drifting out in the ocean in a shark cage because the rope had been bitten off. And he was just happy. He was happy to be drifting down there. Anyway, it was a funny story. And it just reminds me of another story on Shark Chronicles. I've got a very, very close friend. He's not a friend anymore, he's a brother. His name's Fredrik Ostrom. We call him Moya. He's from Sweden. And he ended up working for me for a year or something like that. Awesome guy. And he came out on an expedition. I came to Sweden in 1994, and I gave a lecture series in Sweden, and I spoke at all the universities and all the rest of it. And then I gave a public talk at some place in Stockholm, a big venue in Stockholm. It was really good. It was a sellout. There were, I don't know, 1,000 people in the audience, whatever. And I gave this public talk. And another very, very good friend of mine, who became a friend, Stefan Fakasti, he actually owns the largest aquarium in Sweden called Tropicarium. And he and his brother and his father own the largest aquarium in Europe, I think, which is Hungary. So they're really into sharks and diving with sharks. So Stefan drove 150 kilometers with 2 of his staff to Stockholm from a place called Kolmården to listen to my lecture because he saw it advertised somewhere. And this venue was right next to Hard Rock Cafe. So after the lecture, we went over to the Hard Rock Cafe. Myself and my wife Jutta, we went over to the Hard Rock Cafe to have something to eat. And Stefan asked if he could join. So Stefan and Eka and Kala, the two of the people that worked for him, they joined us and we chatted. Anyway, long story short, Stefan and Eka and Kala, and then Fredrik, this other friend of mine that we've become very, very close, they came out, the 4 of them came out on a special expedition. So they contacted me, they stayed in contact, and they said, can they do an expedition just for the 4 of them? And I said, sure, we can do this. And we got out. This was the old days in South Africa, where it was rough and wild and unsophisticated. It was like the Wild West. You made your own rules as you went along. The best days. Not like now. Now it's just shit. All rules and regulations and all this crap. But those days, there was no tourism. We were cut off from the rest of the world. We were very secluded. We didn't know what was going on around the world except in South Africa. That was our world. And my world was great white sharks. I didn't give a shit about anything else. I just wanted to work with great white sharks. So I actually picked them up at the airport in Cape Town. It was called Cape Town International Airport, but it might as well have been Cape Town Boondocks Airport. It was a little pisshole building where the plane landed, and customs was a window you walked past and gave your passport and they stamped it, and you were at the airport. There was nothing modern in that airport at all. It was probably the size of my house. And so I just pulled up in front of the airport with this big Ford F250 pickup, and on the back of the pickup is a freezer full of bait and chum, and there's the boats behind me and the shark cage. And these guys come walking out of the airport, and there's the pickup and the boat and the cage and everything standing right there. So there's 4 of them. I say, well, 2 of you can hop in the front of the pickup because it's a big pickup and sit on the chair, and 2 of you hop in the back of the pickup. This was like good old days, And off we go. So 2 of them are lying on the back of the pickup and they're sleeping in the sun, and I'm driving, and Fredrik and Stefan are sitting next to me, and we're talking sharks and talking shit and all the rest of it. And eventually we get to Gansbaai, we have a barbecue, and this is a man's world. It's a man's world. And It's beers and barbecue and great white sharks. That's what it is. And boats and big pickups and the ocean. You can't get better. It's the best. Anyway, we go out the next morning. Get out to see him. We still got one of those round cages. That's what we used. And we get a big shark. We actually call it green teeth. And this is kind of a strange thing. I'm just going to go into the shark a little bit because all the teeth here in the top jaw were green from algae. They were completely green. There was so much algae on the teeth that this was literally as green as an avocado, which meant that that shark had not fed for a very long time. At least a month to 2 months, at least, that shark had not fed. In order to pick up green growth, algae on your teeth as a shark, and it's the only one I've ever seen like that, ever. Very, very interesting actually. And which means that shark had not fed for a long period. And I don't know why, because when it was at the boat, it wanted to feed. It had no problem feeding whatsoever. So my theory is that shark had crossed a very large distance of ocean, or vast distance of ocean. It probably swam in from South America or North America or Australia, and it either just not found anything to feed on, or had not managed to capture something to feed on, or for some reason it just was not in a feeding pattern for a month or two, or even maybe longer. I'm not quite sure. But its teeth were green. Green, green, green. Anyway, so Frederick, he's the first one to go in the cage. He's green, and it's a big shark. So 4.5, 4.7 meter great white shark, a big animal. And so Frederick, I said, okay, you can go in the cage. So he says he wants to go in the cage first. So he gets all kitted up, and he gets in the cage, and he's nervous, which is natural. You've never been in the cage with a great white shark. You've never been in a bird cage with a great white shark. So he gets in there, and he's hanging on the side of the cage, looking at me. And I say, okay, go down. The shark's there. And he goes down, and he goes down into the cage. And as he turns his head, green teeth comes in and just smashes that cage. It just, the shark, there was something nuts about the shark. And Frederick's first 3 seconds in that water were the most terrifying seconds you can believe for any human being. Because he went down and he turned his head, and as he turned his head, the shark just smashed right into the cage, right into the port. The cage concaved like that. It actually concaved the cage, and he had the shark here. So he had the shark like almost in his face. And he came shooting out of that cage like a Polaris missile. And I'll never forget it. What an experience. Anyway, that's what I got to say on this video, and we'll continue with Shark Chronicles in a little bit.